Hello. Okay, so I'm going to do a reading day. Flannery O'Connor short stories. I have this friend, a Kiwi. I have this friend, a berry. I have the cicadas outside. Oh, ow. I have this friend, it's a hot tea with melatonin in it. I didn't know they made that. I didn't know you could liquefy melatonin into such a delicious form. It's good. Okay, so I haven't picked a story. There's one with a really bad word in the title because history is complicated. So I've read A Good Man is Hard to Find. It's dark. It's a good one. It's about this family who, there's a serial killer on the loose, and this family's trying to go to Disney World. They find the killer. Trust. The life you save may be your own. That sounds good. And I read this story, Good Country People. It's a good one. That hit me. It's dark. So, my favorite artist, PJ Harvey, wrote a song based on Good Country People. That's why I read it. And so from the same album, she has a song called The River. I'm thinking we read the story called The River. Let's just see what's in store for that one. It's so funny. The grandmother did not want to go to Florida. That's not the story we're reading. That's just from the one where they go to Disney World and meet the misfit. He gets their asses good. All right. The River. I don't know anything about this story. If it's based on the song, then I know it based on the song, but the song doesn't have much of a plot. It's just about these people who want to wash away their sins. Okay. The child stood glum and limp in the middle of the dark living room while his father pulled him into a plaid coat. His right arm was hung in the sleeve, but the father buttoned the coat anyway and pushed him forward toward a pale spotted hand that stuck through the half-open door. Good line. He ain't fixed right, a loud voice said from the hall. Well then, for Christ's sakes, fix him, the father muttered. 6 o'clock in the morning. He was in his bathrobe, barefooted. When he got the child to the door and tried to shut it, he found her looming in it, a speckled skeleton in a long pea-green coat and felt helmet. And his and my car fare, she said. It'll be twicked we have to ride the car. It'll be twicked we have to ride the car. He went in the bedroom again to get the money, and when he came back, she and the boy were both standing in the middle of the room. She was taking stock. I couldn't smell those dead cigarette butts long if I was ever to come sit with you, she said, shaking him down in his coat. Here's the change, the father said. He went to the door and opened it wide and waited. After she had counted the money, she slipped it somewhere inside her coat and walked over to a watercolor hanging near the phonograph. I know what time it is, she said, peering closely at the black lines crossing into broken planes of violet color. I ought to. My shift starts on at 10 p.m. and don't get off till 5, and it takes me 1 hour to ride the Vine Street car. Oh, I see, he said. Well, we'll expect him back tonight about 8 or 9. Maybe later, she said. We're going to the river to a healing. This particular preacher don't get around this way often. I wouldn't have paid for that, she said, nodding at the painting. I would have drew it myself. All right, Mrs. Connon, we'll see you then, he said, drumming on the door. A toneless voice called from the bedroom, Bring me an ice pack. Too bad his mama's sick, Mrs. Connon said. What's her trouble? We don't know, he muttered. We'll ask the preacher to pay for her. Pray for her. He's healed a lot of folks, the Reverend Bevel Summers. Maybe she ought to see him sometime. Maybe so, he said. We'll see you tonight. And he disappeared into the bedroom and left them to go. The little boy stared at her silently, his nose and eyes running. He was about 4 or 5. He had a long face and bulging chin and half-shut eyes set far apart. He seemed mute and patient, like an old sheep waiting to be let out. You'll like this preacher, she said, the Reverend Bevel Summers. You ought to hear him sing. The bedroom door opened suddenly, and the father stuck his head out and said, Goodbye, old man, have a good time. Goodbye, the little boy said, and jumped as if he'd been shot. It's crazy. Mrs. Connon gave the watercolor another look. Then they went out into the hall and rang for the elevator. I wouldn't have drew it, she said. Outside, the gray morning was blocked off on either side by the unlit, empty buildings. It's going to be fair up later, she said, but this is the last time we'll be able to have any preaching at the river this year. Wipe your noise, sugar boy. He began rubbing his sleeve across it, but she stopped him. That ain't nice, she said. Where's your handkerchief? He put his hands in his pockets and pretended to look for it while she waited. Some people don't care how they send one off, she murmured, reflection in the coffee shop window. You pervert. She took a red and blue flowered handkerchief out of her pocket and stooped down and began to work on his nose. Now blow, she said, and he blew. You can borrow it. Put it in your pocket. You can borrow it. Put it in your pocket. He folded it up and put it in his pocket carefully, and they walked on to the corner and leaned against the side of a closed drugstore to wait for the car. Mrs. Connon turned up her coat collar so that it met her hat in the back. Her eyelids began to droop, and she looked as if she might go to sleep against the wall. The little boy put a slight pressure on her hand. What's your name? She asked in a drowsy voice. I don't know but only your last name. I should have found out your first name. His name was Harry Ashfield, and he had never thought at any time before of changing it. Bevel, he said. Mrs. Connon raised herself from the wall. Why, ain't that a coincidence? She said. I told you that's the name of this preacher. Bevel, he repeated. She stood looking down at him as if he had become a marvel to her. I'll have to meet him some time, she said. He's no ordinary preacher. He's a healer. He couldn't do nothing for Mr. Connon, though. Mr. Connon didn't have the faith, but he said he would try anything once. He had this griping in his gut. The trolley appeared as a yellow spot at the end of the deserted street. He's gone to the government hospital now, she said. And they'd taken 1/3 of his stomach. I tell him he better thank Jesus for what he's got left, but he says he ain't thanking nobody. Well, I declare, she murmured. Bevel. They walked out to the tracks to wait. Will he heal me? Bevel asked. What you got? I'm hungry, he decided finally. Didn't you have your breakfast? I didn't have time to be hungry yet then, he said. Well, when we get home, we'll both have us something, she said. I'm ready myself. They got on the car and sat down a few seats behind the driver, and Mrs. Connon took Bevel on her knees. Now you be a good boy, she said, and let me get some sleep. Just don't get off my lap. She lay her head back, and as he watched, gradually her eyes closed and her mouth fell open to show a few long, scattered teeth, some gold and some darker than her face. She began to whistle and blow like a musical skeleton. There was no one in the car but themselves and the driver, and when he saw she was asleep, he took out the flowered handkerchief and unfolded it and examined it carefully. Then he folded it up again and unzipped a place in the inner lining of his coat and hid it in there, and shortly himself was asleep. That was not right. Her house was a half-mile from the end of the car line, set back a little from the road. It was a tan paper brick with a porch across the front of it and a tin top. On the porch there were 3 little boys of different sizes with identical speckled faces, and one tall girl who had her hair up in so many aluminum curlers that it glared like the roof. The 3 boys followed them inside and closed in on Bevel. They looked at him silently, not smiling. That's Bevel, Mrs. Connon said, taking off her coat. It's a coincidence he's named the same as the preacher. These boys are J.C., Spivey, and Sinclair. And that's Sarah Mildred on the porch. Take off that coat and hang it on the bedpost, Bevel. The 3 boys watched him while he unbuttoned the coat and took it off. Then they watched him hang it on the bedpost, and then they stood watching the coat. They turned abruptly and went out the door and had a conference on the porch. Bevel stood looking around him at the room. It was part kitchen and part bedroom. The entire house was 2 rooms and 2 porches. Close to his foot, the tail of a light-colored dog moved up and down between the 2 floorboards as he scratched his back on the underside of the house. Bevel jumped on it, but this hound was experienced and had already withdrawn when his feet hit the spot. The walls were filled with pictures and calendars. There were 2 round photographs of an old man and woman with collapsed mouths, and a picture of a man whose eyebrows dashed out of 2 bushes of hair and clashed in a heap on the bridge of his nose. The rest of his face stuck out like a bare cliff to fall from. She popped off on that little description. That was crazy. That's Mr. Connon, Mrs. Connon said, standing back from the stove for a second to admire the face with him. But it don't favor him any more. Bevel turned from Mr. Connon to a colored picture over the bed of a man wearing a white sheet. He had long hair and a gold circle around his head, and he was sawing on a board while some children stood watching him. He was going to ask who that was when the 3 boys came in again and motioned for him to follow them. He thought of crawling under the bed and hanging onto one of the legs, but the 3 boys only stood there, speckled and silent, waiting, and after a second he followed them, at a little distance, out on the porch and around the corner of the house. They started off through a field of rough yellow weeds to the hog pen, a 5-foot boarded square full of shoats, which they intended to ease him over into. When they reached it, they turned and waited silently, leaning against the side. He was coming very slowly, deliberately bumping his feet together as if he had trouble walking. Once he had been beaten up in the park by some strange boys when his sitter forgot him. But he hadn't known anything was going to happen that time until it was over. He began to smell a strong odor of garbage and to hear the noises of a wild animal. He stopped a few feet from the pen and waited, pale but dogged. didn't move. Something seemed to have happened to them. They stared over his head as if they saw something coming behind him, but he was afraid to turn his own head and look. Their speckles were pale and their eyes were still and gray as glass. Only their ears twitched slightly. Nothing happened. Finally, the one in the middle said she'd kill us, and turned, dejected and hacked, and climbed up on the pen and hung over, staring in. Bevel sat down on the ground, dazed with relief, and grinned up at them. The one sitting on the pen glanced at him severely. "Hey, you," he said after a second. "If you can't climb up and see these pigs, you can lift that bottom board off and look in that way." He appeared to offer this as a kindness. Bevel had never seen a real pig, but he had seen a pig in a book and knew they were small, fat, pink animals with curly tails and round, grinning faces and bow ties. He leaned forward and pulled eagerly at the board. "Pull harder," the littlest boy said. "It's nice and rotten. Just lift out that nail." He eased a long reddish nail out of the soft wood. "Now you can lift up the board and put your face to the—" A quiet voice began. He had already done it, and another face, gray, wet, and sour, was pushing into his, knocking him down and back as it scraped out under the plank. Something snorted over him and charged back again, rolling him over and pushing him up from behind, and then sending him forward, screaming through the yellow field while it bounded behind. The three Connons watched from where they were. The one sitting on the pen held the loose board back with his dangling foot. Their stern faces didn't brighten any, but they seemed to become less taut, as if some great need had been partly satisfied. "Ma ain't going to like him letting out that hog," the smallest one said. Mrs. Connon was on the back porch and caught Bevel up as he reached the steps. The hog ran under the house and subsided, panting, but the child screamed for 5 minutes. It's a long time. When she had finally calmed him down, she gave him breakfast and let him sit on her lap while he ate it. The shoat climbed the 2 steps bound to the back porch and stood outside the screen door, looking in with his head lowered sullenly. He was long-legged and hump-backed, and part one of his ears had been bitten off. "Get away," Mrs. Connon shouted. "That one yonder favors Mr. Paradise that has the gas station," she said. "You'll see him today at the healing. He's got the cancer over his ear. He always comes to the show. He ain't yet been healed." The shoat stood squinting a few seconds longer and then moved off slowly. "I don't want to see him," said Bevel. Mr. Paradise at the gas station with the cancer over the ear. It's beautiful. Right. It's like a little break. They walked to the river. Mrs. Connon in front with him and the 3 boys strung out behind, and Sarah Mildred, the tall girl, at the end to holler if one of them ran out on the road. They looked like the skeleton of an old boat with 2 pointed ends, sailing slowly on the edge of the highway. "She's good." There'll just be a sentence every once in a while that just They looked like the skeleton of an old boat with 2 pointed ends sailing slowly on the edge of the highway. The white Sunday sun followed at a little distance, climbing fast through a scum of gray clouds as if it meant to overtake them. Bevel walked on the outside edge, holding Mrs. Connon's hand and looking down into the orange and purple gully that dropped off from the concrete. It occurred to him that he was lucky this time that they had found Mrs. Connon, who would take you away for the day instead of an ordinary sitter who only sat where you lived or went to the park. You found out more when you left where you lived. He had found out already, but I'm scared though. He had found out already this morning that he had been made by a carpenter named Jesus Christ. Before, he had thought it had been a doctor named Sladewall, a fat man with a yellow mustache who gave him shots and thought his name was Herbert, but this must have been a joke. They joked a lot where he lived. If he had thought about it before, he would have thought Jesus Christ was a word like oh or damn or God. Or maybe somebody who had cheated them out of something sometime. Like, it makes me gag how good it was a good page. When he had asked Mrs. Connon who the man in the sheet in the picture over the bed was, she had looked at him a while with her mouth open. Then she had said, "That's Jesus," and she had kept on looking at him. In a few minutes, she had got up and got a book out of the other room. "See here," she said, turning over the cover. "This belonged to my great-grandmama. I wouldn't part with it for nothing on earth." She ran her finger under some brown writing on a spotted page. "Emma Stevens Oakley, 1832, she said. "Ain't that something to have? And every word of it the gospel truth." She turned to the next page and read him the name, The Life of Jesus Christ for Readers Under 12. Then she read him the book. It was a small book, pale brown on the outside with gold edges and a smell like old putty. It was full of pictures, one of the carpenter driving a crowd of pigs out of a man. They were real pigs, gray and sour-looking, and Mrs. Connon said Jesus had driven them all out of this one man. When she finished reading, she let him sit on the floor and look at the pictures again. Just before they left for the healing, he had managed to get the book inside his inner lining without her seeing him. Now it made his coat hang down a little farther on one side than the other. His mind was dreamy and serene as they walked along, and when they turned off the highway onto a long red clay road winding between banks of honeysuckle, he began to make wild leaps and pulled forward on her hand as if he wanted to dash off and snatch the sun, which was rolling away ahead of them now. They walked on the dirt road for a while, and then they crossed a field stippled with purple weeds and entered the shadows of a wood where the ground was covered with thick pine needles. He had never been in the woods before, and he had walked carefully, looking from side to side as if he was entering a strange country. They moved along a bridle path that twisted downhill through crackling red leaves, and once, catching at a branch to keep himself from slipping, he looked into two frozen green gold eyes enclosed in the darkness of a tree hole. At the bottom of the hill, the woods opened suddenly onto a pasture, dotted here and there with black and white cows, sloping down tier after tier to a broad orange stream where the reflection of the sun was set like a diamond. There were people standing on the near bank in a group singing. Long tables were set up behind them, and a few cars and trucks were parked in a road that came up by the river, the titular river. It had the Sleepy Bear on the cover of the box, but it also said melatonin really big. It's special. They crossed the pasture, hurrying, because Mrs. Connon, using her hand for a shade over her eyes, saw the preacher already standing out in the water. She dropped her basket on one of the tables and pushed the three boys in front of her into the knot of people so that they wouldn't linger by the food. She kept Bevel by the hand and eased her way up to the front. The preacher was standing about 10 feet out in the stream where the water came up to his knees. He was a tall youth in khaki trousers that he had rolled up higher than the water. He had on a blue shirt and a red scarf around his neck, but no hat, and his light-colored hair was cut in sideburns that curved into the hollows of his cheeks. His face was all bone and red reflected from the river. He looked as if he might have been 19 years old. He was singing in a high, twangy voice above the singing on the bank, and he kept his hands behind him and his head tilted back. He ended the hymn on a high note and stood silent, looking down at the water and shifting his feet in it. Then he looked up at the people on the bank. They stood close together, waiting. Their faces were solemn but expectant, and every eye was on him. He shifted his feet again. "Maybe I know why you come," he said in his twangy voice. "Maybe I don't. If you ain't come for Jesus, you ain't come for me. If you just come to see, can you leave your pain in the river? You ain't come for Jesus. You can't leave your pain in the river," he said. "I never told nobody that." He stopped and looked down at his knees. "I seen you cure a woman once," a sudden high voice shouted from the hump of people. "Seen that woman get up and walk out straight where she had limped in." The preacher lifted one foot and then the other. He seemed almost but not quite to smile. I just had to practice. "You might as well go home if that's what you come for," he said. Then he lifted his head and arms and shouted, "Listen to what I gotta say, you people. There ain't but one river, and that's the river of life made out of Jesus' blood. That's the river you have to lay your pain in the river of faith, in the river of life, in the river of love, in the rich red river of Jesus' blood, you people." His voice grew soft and musical. "All the rivers come from that one river and go back to it like it was the ocean sea, and if you believe, you can lay your pain in that river and get rid of it, because that's the river that was made to carry sin. It's a river full of pain itself, moving toward the kingdom of Christ, to be washed away slow. You people, slow as this here old red water river round my feet." So, pause. His voice grew soft and musical. Cue in PJ Harvey's attention, because all of those are lyrics from the song. "And the pain in the river wash away slow. Pain in the river, leave your pain in the river. The white light scattered, wash away slow." It's so funny. It's seriously, it's like his voice grew musical. PJ was like, "I have an idea." Okay. "Listen," he sang. "I read in Mark about an unclean man. I read in Luke about a blind man. I read in John about a dead man. Oh, you people here, the same blood that makes this river red made that leper clean, made that blind man stare, made that dead man leap. You people with trouble," he cried, "lay it in that river of blood, lay it in that river of pain, and watch it move away toward the kingdom of Christ." I don't know about that. It scares me. While he preached, Bevel's eyes followed drowsily the slow circles of two silent birds revolving high in the air. Across the river there was a low red and gold grove of sassafras with hills of dark blue trees behind it, and an occasional pine jutting over the skyline. Behind, in the distance, the city rose like a cluster of warts on the side of the mountain. The birds revolved downward and dropped lightly in the top of the highest pine, and sat hunched-shouldered as if they were supporting the sky. Could make me cry. Sorry. It's incredible. I don't have a pencil, but that's incredible. "If it's this river of life you want to lay your pain in, then come up," the preacher said, "and lay your sorrow here. But don't be thinking this is the last of it, because this old red river don't end here. This old red suffering stream goes on, you people, slow to the kingdom of Christ. This old red river is good to baptize in, good to lay your faith in, good to lay your pain in, but it ain't this muddy water here that saves you. I've been all up and down this river this week," he said. Tuesday, I was in Fortune Lake. Next day in Ideal. Friday, me and my wife drove to Lullawillow to see a sick man there. Them people didn't see no healing, he said, and his face burned redder for a second. I never said they would. While he was talking, a fluttering figure had begun to move forward with a kind of butterfly movement. An old woman with flapping arms whose head wobbled as if it might fall off any second. She managed to lower herself at the edge of the bank and let her arms churn in the water. Then she bent farther and pushed her face down in it and raised herself up finally, streaming wet. And still flapping, she turned a time or two in a blind circle until someone reached out and pulled her back into the group. She's been that way for 13 years, a rough voice shouted. Pass the hat and give this kid his money. That's what he's here for. The shout, directed out to the boy in the river, came from a huge old man who sat like a humped stone on the bumper of a long, ancient gray automobile. He had on a gray hat that was turned down over one ear and up over the other to expose a purple bulge on his left temple. It's Mr. Paradise. He sat bent forward with his hands, because he's like an automobile. He sat bent forward with his hands hanging between his knees and his small eyes half closed. Bevel stared at him once. I was going to say he's kind of like Bevel. Bevel stared at him once and then moved into the folds of Mrs. Connon's coat and hid himself. The boy in the river glanced at the old man quickly and raised his fist. Believe Jesus or the devil, he cried. Testify to one or the other. I know from my own self-experience, a woman's mysterious voice called from the knot of people. I know from it that this preacher can heal. My eyes have been opened. I testify to Jesus. The preacher lifted his arms quickly and began to repeat all that he had said before about the river and the kingdom of Christ, and the old man sat on the bumper, fixing him with a narrow squint. From time to time, Bevel stared at him again from around Mrs. Connon. They've got something in common, I think. A man in overalls and a brown coat leaned forward and dipped his hand in the water quickly and shook it and leaned back, and a woman held a baby over the edge of the bank and splashed its feet with water. One man moved a little distance away and sat down on the bank and took off his shoes and waded out into the stream. He stood there for a few minutes with his face tilted as far back as it would go. Then he waded back and put on his shoes. All this time the preacher sang and did not appear to watch what went on. Like that. As soon as he stopped singing, Mrs. Connon lifted Bevel up and said, "Listen here, preacher. I got a boy from town today that I'm keeping. His mama's sick and he wants you to pray for her. And this is a coincidence. His name is Bevel." "Bevel," she said, turning to look at the people behind her, same as his. "Ain't that a coincidence, though?" There were some murmurs, and Bevel turned and grinned over her shoulder at the faces looking at him. "Bevel," he said in a loud, jaunty voice. "Listen," Mrs. Connon said. "Have you ever been baptized, Bevel?" He only grinned. "I suspect he ain't ever been baptized," Mrs. Connon said, raising her eyebrows at the preacher. "Swang him over here," the preacher said, and took a stride forward and caught him. He held him in the crook of his arm and looked at the grinning face. Bevel rolled his eyes in a comical way and thrust his face forward close to the preacher's. "My name is Bevel," he said in a loud, deep voice, and let the tip of his tongue slide across his mouth. The preacher didn't smile. His bony face was rigid, and his narrow gray eyes reflected the almost colorless sky. There was a loud laugh from the old man sitting on the car bumper, and Bevel grasped the back of the preacher's collar and held it tightly. The grin had suddenly disappeared from his face. He had the sudden feeling that this was not a joke. Where he lived, everything was a joke. From the preacher's face, he knew immediately that nothing the preacher said or did was a joke. My mother named me that, he said quickly. Have you ever been baptized? The preacher asked. What's that? He murmured. If I baptize you, the preacher said, you'll be able to go to the kingdom of Christ. You'll be washed in the river of suffering, son. And you'll go by the deep river of life. Do you want that? Yes, the child said, and thought, I won't go back to the apartment then. I'll go under the river. You won't be the same again, the preacher said. You'll count. It's brutal. He turned his face to the people and began to preach, and Bevel looked over his shoulder at the pieces of the white sun scattered in the river. Suddenly the preacher said, all right, I'm going to baptize you now. And without more warning, he tightened his hold and swung him upside down and plunged his head into the water. He held him under while he said the words of baptism, and then he jerked him up again and looked sternly at the gasping child. Bevel's eyes were dark and dilated. You count now, the preacher said. You didn't even count before. The little boy was too shocked to cry. He spit out the muddy water and rubbed his wet sleeve into his eyes and over his face. Don't forget his mama, Mrs. Connon called. He wants you to pray for his mama. She's sick. Lord, the preacher said, we pray for somebody in affliction who isn't here to testify. Is your mother sick in the hospital? He asked. Is she in pain? The child stared at him. She hasn't gotten up yet, he said in a high, dazed voice. She has a hangover. The air was so quiet he could hear the broken pieces of the sun knocking in the water. The preacher looked angry and startled. The red drained out of his face and the sky appeared to darken in his eyes. There was a loud guffaw from the bank, and Mr. Paradise shouted, Ha! Cure the afflicted woman with the hangover, and began to beat his knee with his fist. It's beautiful. I can't even freaking believe that. This break. I don't know what to call that. That's why I'm showing you. That was beautiful. He's had a long day, Mrs. Connon said, standing with him in the door of the apartment and looking sharply into the room where the party was going on. I reckon it's past his regular bedtime. One of Bevel's eyes was closed and the other half closed. His nose was running and he kept his mouth open and breathed through it. The damp plaid coat dragged down one side. That would be her, Mrs. Connon decided, in the black breeches, long black satin breeches and barefoot sandals and red toenails. She was lying on half the sofa with her knees crossed in the air and her head propped on the arm. She didn't get up. Hello, Harry, she said. Did you have a big day? She had a long, pale face, smooth and blank, and straight, sweet potato color hair, pulled back. The father went off to get the money. There were two other couples. One of the men, blond with little violet blue eyes, leaned out of his chair and said, Well, Harry, old man, have a big day? His name ain't Harry, it's Bevel, Mrs. Connon said. His name is Harry, she said from the sofa. She said from the sofa. Who ever heard of anybody named Bevel? The little boy had seemed to be going to sleep on his feet, his head drooping farther and farther forward. He pulled it back suddenly and opened one eye. The other was stuck. He told me this morning his name is Bevel, Mrs. Connon said in a shocked voice. The same as our preacher. We've been all day at a preaching and healing at the river. He said his name is Bevel, the same as the preacher's. That's what he told me. Bevel, his mother said. My God, what a name. His preacher is named Bevel, and there's no better preacher around, Mrs. Connon said. Furthermore, she added in a defiant tone, he baptized this child this morning. His mother sat straight up. Oh, the nerve, she muttered. Furthermore, Mrs. Connon said, he's a healer, and he prayed for you to be healed. Healed, she almost shouted. Healed of what? For Christ's sake. Of your affliction, Mrs. Connon said icily. The The father had returned with the money and was standing near Mrs. Connon, waiting to give it to her. His eyes were lined with red threads. That gets me. His eyes were lined with red threads. Go on, he said. I want to hear more about her affliction. The exact nature of it has escaped. He waved the bill and his voice trailed off. Healing by prayer is mighty and expensive, he murmured. Mrs. Connon stood a second, staring into the room with the skeleton's appearance of seeing everything. Then, without taking the money, she turned and shut the door behind her. The father swung around, smiling vaguely, and shrugged. The rest of them were looking at Harry. The little boy began to shamble toward the bedroom. Come here, Harry, his mother said. He automatically shifted his direction toward her without opening his eye any farther. Tell me what happened today, she said when he reached her. She began to pull off his coat. I don't know, he muttered. Yes, you do know, she said, feeling the coat heavier on one side. She unzipped the inner lining and caught the book and a dirty handkerchief as they fell out. Where did you get these? I don't know, he said, and grabbed for them. They're mine, she gave them to me. She threw the handkerchief down and held the book too high for him to reach, began to read it, her face after a second assuming an exaggerated comical expression. The others moved around and looked at it over her shoulder. My God, somebody said. One of the men peered at it sharply from behind a thick pair of glasses. He's scientific. It's valuable, he said. It's a collector's item. And he took it away from the rest of them and retired to another chair. Don't let George go off with that, his girl said. I'll tell you it's valuable, George said, 1832. Any character with glasses is interesting to me, because in middle school I read Lord of the Flies in class, and they said Piggy had glasses because he could see from a more technological, civilized perspective, and all the other boys couldn't. They didn't have glasses. So, of course, the guy with glasses is like assessing its monetary value. Literature. I'm just being stupid. Bevel is just a core memory. Bevel shifted his direction again toward the room where he slept. He shut the door behind him and moved slowly in the darkness to the bed and sat down and took his shoes off and got under the cover. After a minute, a shaft of light let in the tall silhouette of his mother. She tiptoed lightly across the room and sat down on the edge of his bed. What did that dolt of a preacher say about me? She whispered. What lies have you been telling today, honey? He shut his eye. What happened to his fucking eye? He shut his eye and heard her voice from a long way away, as if he were under the river and she on top of it. Something happened. She shook his shoulder. Harry, she said, leaning down and putting her mouth to his ear. Tell me what he said. She pulled him into a sitting position, and he felt as if he had been drawn up from under the river. Tell me, she whispered, and her bitter breath covered his face. He saw the pale oval close to him in the dark. He said, I'm not the same now, he muttered. I count. After a second, she lowered him by his shirt front onto the pillow. She hung over him an instant and brushed her lips against his forehead. Then she got up and moved away, swaying her hips lightly through the shaft of light. It's fascinating. I don't understand yet. It's so strange. Alright, we got 5 pages left. He didn't wake up early, but the apartment was still dark and closed when he did. For a while he lay there, picking his nose and eyes. Then he sat up in bed and looked out the window. The sun came in palely stained gray by the glass. Across the street at the Empire Hotel, the colored cleaning woman was looking down from an upper window, resting her face on her folded arms. He got up and put on his shoes and went to the bathroom and then into the front room. He ate 2 crackers spread with anchovy paste that he found on the coffee table, and drank some ginger ale left in a bottle and looked around for his book, but it was not there. I had ginger ale at dinner. The apartment was silent except for the faint humming of the refrigerator. He went into the kitchen and found some raisin bread heels, and spread a half a jar of peanut butter between them, and climbed up on the tall kitchen stool and sat chewing the sandwich slowly, wiping his nose every now and then on his shoulder. When he finished, he found some chocolate milk and drank that. He would rather have had the ginger ale, he saw, but they left the bottle openers where he couldn't reach them. He studied what was left in the refrigerator for a while. Some shriveled vegetables that she had forgot were there, and a lot of brown oranges that she bought and didn't squeeze. There were 3 or 4 kinds of cheese and something fishy in a paper bag. The rest was a pork bone. That would be a good line in a poem. The rest was a pork bone. He left the refrigerator door open and wandered back into the dark living room and sat down on the sofa. He decided they would be out cold until 1 o'clock and that they would all have to go to a restaurant for lunch. He wasn't high enough for the table yet, and the waiter would bring a high chair. And he was too big for a high chair. What age is this child? Like, is he old? Is he young? It's like impossible to tell. It's awesome. Then he got up and wandered around the room, looking into the ashtrays at the butts as if this might be a habit. In his own room, he had picture books and blocks, but they were for the most part torn up. He found the way to get new ones was to tear up the ones he had. There was very little to do at any time but eat. However, he was not a fat boy. He decided he would empty a few of the ashtrays on the floor. If he only emptied a few, she would think they had fallen. He emptied 2, rubbing the ashes carefully into the rug with his finger. Then he lay on the floor a while, studying his feet, which he held up in the air. His shoes were still damp, and he began to think about the river. Sorry. Very slowly, his expression changed, as if he were gradually seeing appear what he didn't know he'd been looking for. Then, all of a sudden, he knew what he wanted to do. He got up and tiptoed into their bedroom and stood in the dim light there, looking for her pocketbook. His glance passed her long, pale arm hanging off the edge of the bed down to the floor and across the white mound his father made, and past the crowded bureau. White. Until it rested on the pocketbook hung on the back of the chair. He took a car token out of it and half a package of lifesavers. Of course. Then he left the apartment and caught the car at the corner. He hadn't taken a suitcase because there was nothing from there he wanted to keep. He got off the car at the end of the line and started down the road he and Mrs. Connon had taken the day before. He knew there wouldn't be anybody at her house because the 3 boys and the girls went to school, and Mrs. Connon had told him she went out to clean. He passed her yard and walked on the way they had gone to the river. The paper brick houses were far apart, and after a while the dirt place to walk on ended, and he had to walk on the edge of the highway. The sun was pale yellow and high and hot. He passed a shack with an orange gas pump in front of it. I know whose gas pump that belongs to. But he didn't see the old man looking out at nothing in particular from the doorway. Mr. Paradise was having an orange drink. He finished it slowly, squinting over the bottle at the small plaid-coated figure disappearing down the road. Then he set the empty bottle on the bench and, still squinting, wiped his sleeve over his mouth. He went in the shack and picked out a peppermint stick, a foot long and 2 inches thick, from the candy shelf and stuck it in his hip pocket. Then he got in his car and drove slowly down the highway after the boy. By the time Bevel came to the field speckled with purple weeds, he was dusty and sweating, and he crossed it at a trot to get into the woods as fast as he could. Once inside, he wandered from tree to tree, trying to find the path that they had taken yesterday. Finally, he had found a line worn in the pine needles and followed it until he saw the steep trail twisting through the trees. Mr. Paradise had left his automobile back way on the road, and he had walked to the place where he was accustomed to sit almost every day, holding an unbaited fish line in the water while he stared at the river passing in front of him. He goes to fish. Anyone looking at him from a distance would have seen an old boulder half hidden in the bushes. It's good. Bevel didn't see him at all. He only saw the river shimmering reddish-yellow, and bounded into it with his shoes and his coat on and took a gulp. He swallowed some and spit the rest out, and then he stood there in water up to his chest and looked around him. The sky was a clear, pale blue all in one piece, except for the hole the sun made. And fringed around the bottom with treetops. His coat floated to the surface and surrounded him like a strange gay lily pad, and he stood grinning in the sun. He intended not to fool with preachers anymore, but to baptize himself, and to keep on going this time until he found the kingdom of Christ in the river. He didn't mean to waste any more time. He put his head under the water at once and pushed forward. In a second he began to gasp and sputter, and his head reappeared on the surface. He started under again, and the same thing happened. The river wouldn't have him. He tried again and came up choking. This was the way it had been with the preacher held him under. He had to fight with something that pushed him back in the face. He stopped and thought suddenly, "It's another joke. It's just another joke." He thought how far he had came for nothing, and he began to hit and splash and kick the filthy river. His feet were already treading on nothing. He gave one low cry of pain and indignation. Then he heard a shout and turned his head and saw something like a giant pig bounding after him, shaking a red and white club and shouting. He plunged under once this time. The wading current caught him like a long, gentle hand and pulled him swiftly forward and down. For an instant he was overcome with surprise. And since he was moving quickly and knew that he was getting somewhere, all his fury and his fear left him. Mr. Paradise's head appeared from time to time on the surface of the water. Finally, far downstream, the old man rose like some ancient water monster and stood empty-handed, staring with his dull eyes as far down the river line as he could see. It's so sad. It's so sad. It's beautiful. That's the ending, by the way. I'm not just being annoying. Wow. Mr. Paradise's head appeared from time to time on the surface of the water. Finally, far downstream, the old man rose like some ancient water monster and stood empty-handed, staring with his dull eyes as far down the river line as he could see. Old man, like everybody would call him an old man. One of the two of them. It's a good story. It's really good.